So what's new with you, man?
Well, I've been reading about Jung's concept of individuation.
Oh yeah, what do you think of it?
So, basically, individuation is the process of becoming an individual, or to put it another way, distinct from the collective. Jung wrote about individuation as a psychological urge, or less frequently as a drive, and a really fundamental urge. Individuation is often understood as the central part of Jung's work, which is interesting to me because I don't think we clearly see the drive or desire for something like individuality as, you could say, intensely as we do drives for things like love or power. But the fact is, people can and almost inevitably do have crises of identity, existential crises, questions about who they really are, what are they really doing.
Sure.
And, those kind of crises, they can drag people really low, like all the way into depression, right? You see it often, the crushing effect not having an answer to those questions can have. It shows how powerful the individuation drive is. And I think they're a necessary crisis from the perspective of the individuation drive. Everyone has them at some point in their life. People have to have them, like there's a reason for it. And I see it as the drive calling forth for an answer, to this question, who are you? It's like the drive is saying you're more than what you are and you need to work that out. And what happens is the individuation drive unconsciously knows that there's some kind of development needed in our conscious sense of self. So it uses these kind of signals,
Right.
Which in extreme forms can turn into crises until we take note of them and really try and develop our sense of self. So, for example, I remember at one time in my life this question, who am I? It would like loop in my head. It would bother me in a way that it doesn't these days. To give an example of how the drive develops, it's not really a question of avoiding these crises. Everyone needs to have them. It's really a question of managing the scale of them, and we often see these kind of crises happening before really important life decisions, like should I get this job? Should I start a family? And it's because such a great deal of the way we talk and the way we think and act, they're wrapped up in identity, right? So when we're faced with these big questions about what to do in life, the answer often lies in understanding this "who am I" question. And if that identity, if the answer to the question isn't secured by a sense of individuality, of knowing this is really me, it can cause people a lot of psychic pain, right? And part of why the individuality drive can feel so frustrated is because we're constantly pushed to sacrifice our individuality to satisfy the desires and expectations of society as well as individuals. We're constantly pushed to say yes to things that clash with our own sense of value and self, and that can happen so often that people lose their own sense of value and self entirely, and that's where these crises can really take hold.
Well, I already, there's a sense of I am an individual, I do have my own name, my experiences, they're my own. My DNA, my body, my fingerprint, everything about me in my very core, there's an absolute individuality to it. And an individuality to my standing in the world, my placement in it. And, there's a million and one facts that only apply to me, and not only about my past, but in the present day. And at the microscopic atomic level, nobody has done anything in exactly the same way that I have. So there's this infinite complexity about the world and our relationship to it that makes everything we do individual and unique. Like, we're given individuality, right? We come into the world with it due to our relations with things, and the grand total of those relations, no one else can match. In fact, there's actually a huge number of things that I can say about myself that no one else can say about themselves. So maybe a lot of what frustrates the individuation drive is just a failing to recognize what's already there, to recognize the ways in which we're already individual. And perhaps the answer to well, at least in my sense, the answer to resolving, or at least coming to terms with these kind of crises, can lie in something like appreciation of the ways we're naturally individual, the ways in which we inherit individuality, for example.
Yeah, well, there's truth in all of that, I have to say. The problem is, if we identify individuality with all these kinds of arbitrary factors, then our individuality becomes arbitrary. You know, our parents' DNA, body, we don't choose these things, they're just given to us. These factors, that they're not our creation, they're not chosen by us, they're accidental in a sense. And we definitely don't want to say that individuality is more determined by our circumstances than by our choices. You know, and if we see ourselves that way, as essentially made up of these arbitrary factors, as those factors determining our individuality, we end up in the existentialist dilemma, I think. You know, that's basically a phenomenological one, right? It's the feeling of being this kind of small, insignificant cog in an overwhelmingly complex universe. And it seems far from clear that there's any meaning or purpose in this kind of complexity that we get stuck in. You know, so we don't just want something to point to in our environment and say, this makes me an individual. We want the feeling of being placed, of mattering, of significance, and being recognized as significant. You know, what's the use of this individuality if no one's around to see it? And we want that rather than the feeling of being stuck or of being overwhelmed. If we just identify ourselves with what we come into the world with, I think it's easy to end up feeling that way. So the second issue is, everyone has an infinitely complex relation to the world. They all have an individual body and name and DNA and so on. And if everyone shares that level of individuality, then it's no individuality at all. You know, it's like Jung said, I can't remember where, but if you add up a million zeros, it still makes zero. You know, it's not unique, and we're really after uniqueness.
At the same time, though, we're often told, that people are the product of their environment and surroundings. You know, that's the behaviorist approach. From the perspective of psychology, the environment conditions us through positive and negative stimuli, and that's what produces our behavior and identity. But it also, that doesn't just have a kind of alienating, existentially painful effect. It helps people understand their own self. You know, it helps them to understand the way in which they act, and also the why they act that way. It gives people comfort in explaining why they're not a perfectly unique individual, you know, and that's the thing. The behaviorist attitude, it can help explain why people might feel existentially divorced, not just making that crisis worse. It's an explanation that lies in recognizing the ways our sense of self is influenced by so many factors, some of which we have very little control over. So while behaviorism might not give a complete solution to the feeling of being existentially divorced from the self, it does give a reason for it in recognizing that we're affected by so many factors, mainly external. You know, so the truth is, it's a painful fact that individuality often has to be sacrificed, and identifying with our environment and upbringing, acknowledging that they're a part of yourself, can be something that actually helps you, rather than the alternative of, you know, wholly rejecting what we come into the world with, because I don't think that really does anybody much good either.
Yeah, it's true, you know, individuation, it can't just be a reactionary process. It can't just be a negative process of saying no to things, of saying no to our environment. And it's definitely possible something like a total denial of the effect our environment has on us can just get in the way of individuation, even if what's being denied is arbitrary. Individuation obviously isn't done just by the childlike counterwill, but still that counterwill is often involved in developing a sense of self, even if just a test whether something really is or isn't part of the self, you know. And what comes to mind is, let's say there's a person of a minority culture, of immigrant parents, and they go to a school, and at that school, they're surrounded by this new culture, and it's different from their home life, from their home culture. And they end up rejecting that culture because it clashes with how they see their friends and how they see this kind of new community that they have to be a part of. So let's say that part gets suppressed.
Yeah.
And then perhaps later in life, they come back to their cultural roots and discover, oh, this is what I've been missing out on, you know. I think that's a somewhat common experience. And that's very much a Jungian hero journey, right? To resurrect dead father culture. But back to my point, sometimes you have to say no to something to realize what you're missing, to be able to properly say yes to it, and say yes in a way that doesn't take it for granted, that simply assumes it's true about me. Because that's very common too, right? Kind of naively identifying with our environment and losing our sense of identity in it, and losing the ability to see the possible ways the environment doesn't match up with our kind of inner sense of individuality. So it does go both ways.
So essentially, basing individuality wholly on environment and upbringing definitely doesn't work. But basing none of it on environment doesn't really seem like a good idea either.
Yeah, that about sums it up. Something to think about, eh?
Yeah, for sure.
Hi listeners, this is Ali, creator of Conversations About Jung, and this is the first video of a series of videos I want to make about individuation. So if you could like the video, that would really help me out, and if you'd like to see more of the series and more conversations about Jung, please consider subscribing. Thank you.